After installing SharePoint, it's time to turn our attention to configuring our farm. Now, what we're going to see is that SharePoint provides a couple of different tools that we can use for configuring our farm. The first tool, and the one that you're going to use most frequently, is Central Administration. Central Administration, as we're going to see, is a web application that's used to administer SharePoint. It really is just a normal SharePoint web application. What's going to make it a bit special, of course, is the fact that it's used to administer SharePoint. Then we're going to turn our attention to talking a little bit about PowerShell, which is the second main tool that we have access to. Now, PowerShell is Microsoft's scripting environment, and PowerShell is great for things where there isn't a UI, since obviously we'll be kind of forced into using PowerShell. But also it's nice for automation. So if I need to configure multiple servers to behave the exact same way, I can very easily do that with PowerShell rather than having to go into Central Administration and doing it over and over and over again. We're going to close off this lesson by talking about some of the different things that we'll need to do once we set up and install SharePoint in our farm. But let's start off by taking a real quick look at the different tools that we have access to. First up, we have Central Administration. Now, as I mentioned before, Central Administration is a SharePoint web application that's used to administer SharePoint. And by far, this is going to be the most common tool that you're going to be using for administering SharePoint. Now, when you install SharePoint, the installer will automatically create a shortcut for you to Central Administration, which you can take advantage of. But if you remember during the installation, one of the things that we saw is that it will ask us for the port number for Central Administration, so I could just simply connect to the server using the appropriate port number from basically anywhere. Let me bring up Central Administration just by going to the Start menu, and I'm going to take advantage of the search feature. So we'll just type out Central, and you'll notice it's the only one that's selected there, so I can just hit Enter, and that will launch Central Administration for me. Now, what I want you to notice about Central Administration is that it's broken down a lot like the Windows control panel. So over on the left-hand side, you're going to notice that we've got all the links to the main sections: Application Management, System Settings, Monitoring, etc. And then you're going to notice in the center there that we also have links to the exact same group. So you'll notice that there's a link to Application Management, a link to Site Settings, but there's also links to the tasks that we're most commonly going to be performing from inside of Central Administration. So for example, one of the things that we'll be doing very frequently when we first set up and get running on SharePoint is getting our web applications into place. So you'll notice that sure enough there's a link that says Manage Web Applications, and yes, if you clicked on that, that would take you to the Manage Web Applications screen. Now, Central Administration is great if I want to be able to do something one time. But if I need to do something multiple times, having to go into Central Administration over and over again to do that is going to get a little bit annoying. This is where PowerShell comes into play. PowerShell is Microsoft's scripting environment. Now, it's used for automation, and the basis for PowerShell is what are known as commandlets. Commandlets are basically command line utilities that are designed to perform one particular operation. Now, what's nice about the commandlets is the fact that they're going to have a consistent syntax, which will be verb-noun. Now, one of the catches to the names of the commandlets is you'll have to be a little bit flexible. Because first of all, depending on where you are, the verb might be slightly different. So for example, it might be add, or it might be new to create a brand new item. Beyond that, the other big thing about PowerShell is that it's a front end for .NET, which serves us sometimes rather well because sometimes there isn't a commandlet that's available to us to perform the operation that we want. So what we could do using PowerShell is go grab the object and then just make API calls to modify it as needed. But the catch with the SharePoint object model, which is what PowerShell is going to use is the fact that all of the objects are going to start with SP and are going to have some names that are going to differ from what's used in the UI. As I like to call it, Sharepoint is consistent in its inconsistencies. So you'll notice that when I want to work with a site, it's actually SP Web. When I want to work with a site collection, it's SP Site. So you just kind of have to roll with that. Now I also want to mention that if you're looking to execute a script on a remote server, that's going to be invoke command. Now no discussion about scripting SharePoint would be complete without at least a mention of STS-ADM. STS-ADM is the old command line utility used to administer SharePoint. STS-ADM is still there, it still works, but it is deprecated. So it's time to move to PowerShell. Now if you haven't worked a whole lot with PowerShell, a couple of things that we want to cover just to make sure we're kind of on the same page. First of all, a couple of commandlets that'll help you out. Get-command. What that will do is that will retrieve commandlets for a specific noun or verb. We've got select, which will give us back to specific columns, because one of the things that we're going to see when we go to grab a series of objects is that they may have a whole host of different properties. So I may only want to display certain properties, and select will allow me to very easily do that. We also have where, which is perfect for doing filters. So that way if I'm maybe querying through a list of services and I only want to see just a couple of different services, then I could use a where statement for that. Now the thing about where is that the operators are going to be slightly different than what we're used to. Then instead of your normal less than, greater than, etc., it's going to be tick LT for less than, tick GT for greater than, tick EQ for equals. You'll also notice that there's a like command as well that I can access by using tick like, and if I want a wildcard, it's just simply going to be an asterisk. Now a couple of other real quick little PowerShell notes. Add PS snap-in. When you launch PowerShell, by default, what's going to happen is PowerShell is just going to load up the root commandlets that it needs to do its thing. But of course, what happens if I want to work with SQL, Exchange, or in our case, SharePoint? Well, in that case, what I need to do is I need to load up the appropriate snap-in. The PowerShell commandlet to do that is add PS snap-in, and then make the call to Microsoft SharePoint PowerShell. The last little thing that I want to highlight before I go in and take a look at how we could do a little bit of PowerShell is how to declare variables. And we declare variables just by simply starting with a $sign. Now if you want to go access the current object, for example as part of a where statement, you can do that by using $_. And that's just simply hard-coded into PowerShell. Now in order to start using PowerShell, again we need that PowerShell snap-in. To help us out, Microsoft, when we install SharePoint, will automatically set up a SharePoint management shell. The management shell, among a few other things, will automatically load in the snap-in for us. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by launching the management shell, which, as I mentioned earlier, will automatically have the PS snap-in loaded. And by the way, if you're going to be doing STS-ADM later on, you'll notice that the management shell also brings the bin directory into scope, so that way STS-ADM will be available without having to change directories. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring up my start menu, and I'm just going to type in management. And you'll notice that will filter, and I'll get my SharePoint 2013 management shell. So let's go ahead and launch that. And that'll take just a second here. Now, one of the neat things, of course, that you can do with any of the windows, you can always change the color scheme. And I always like to make things a little bit more readable. So all you have to do is just simply right-click, go to Properties. And it's just like the command window here. So I can just go straight into Font, 12 by 16. Go to Colors, and I can set my background to be white, my foreground to be black, and hit OK. And away we go. And the nice part about doing that is that once you make that first change, it'll then be saved from there on forward. So if you're looking for a more readable color scheme, then that's a very easy way to do that. Now the other very big thing that I want to do here is just make a little bit more room on the screen. So just sort of like DOS CD / to go back to the C drive, and then CLS to clear the screen. And so now we've got a clean slate that we can work from. One of my favorite features of PowerShell is the fact that you can use PowerShell to navigate around and figure out and find out what it is that you are looking for. And one of the biggest commandlets that's going to help you out is a commandlet called get command, as I had mentioned earlier. And what get command will allow us to do is it will allow us to specify a verb or a noun, so that way basically an action or an object, and it will give us all the different commands that are associated with that. So if you're looking for all the different things that you could create with the keyword new, then you could say tick verb and then new. If you're looking for all the different things that you could do to, say, for example, a site collection, then you could specify tick noun and then sp site. In my case, I just want to take a look at the sp web commandlets that are available to me. So I'm going to do that by saying tick noun, and then sp web, and I'll hit enter, and this will give me back all of the commandlets that are available for sp web. And so you'll notice that we've got export, we've got get, we've got import, we've got new, we've got remove, and we've got set. Well, let's say that I'm looking for a little bit more information about get sp web. So what I could do is I could say get help and then get sp web and hit enter. And you'll notice that since this is the first time that I'm using this, I'm going to get prompted to download the help file here. So I'm just going to say yes, just hit enter. Give that just a moment. And now we get the help file for the get sp web commandlet. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scroll up here, and you'll notice that we get the name, the little synopsis, which will just give us some basic information about the commandlet and what it's going to do. And then if I scroll on down, you'll notice that it will show me the syntax, it'll show me the description, and give me some really good information about what it is that I could do with this commandlet. So in this case, what this would do is this would connect out to a web object for us, or again, remember that that's going to be a SharePoint site. Now, down towards the bottom of the help file here, and I'm just going to page down to that, you'll notice that we get links to more information on Microsoft's site. And then you'll also notice that we get a couple of remarks at the very end here. And the one that I really want to call out inside of there is the tick examples. If you're anything like me, and I know I am, one of the very simple things that I always look for is just a real quick example, that if I can see it done once, then I can usually modify that for my own evil purposes. And that's why I really like examples, because examples will give me a lot of, well, examples that I can then use to figure out what it is that I'm trying to do. So what we can do is we can just use the up arrow, actually, which will bring back the last command. So in our case, get a help, get sp web, and then tick. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to type out E for examples, but this time I'm going to use a tab. And you'll notice that my tab will give me an autocomplete there. So it will automatically type out examples for me, and now I can hit enter. And you'll notice that it will give me a few different examples. So it gives me examples on just a very basic, hey, let's connect up to a web. Down below, you'll notice it gives me one with a query inside of example 2. And then just down below that, inside of example 3, it gets even a little bit fancier by going in and setting a property and calling update to save that back. In my case, I just want to connect out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say get sp web, and then we'll say http:// SharePoint 2013:4242. Now, if you remember from before, that is our central admin site. And central admin is, at the end of the day, just a normal SharePoint site. So I could actually connect to it, generally speaking, just as if it was a normal SharePoint site. Now, when I hit enter here, what's going to happen is it's going to display out the default property, which in this case just happens to be the URL. Now, if I wanted to get more information from this, or maybe I wanted to work with the object, then what I could do is I could declare a variable, and remember variables start with a $sign. So I could say $web equals get spweb http :// SharePoint 2013 :4242 and hit enter. And now you'll notice when I do this that I don't get any response back. And this is always one of those funny little things about PowerShell is quite frequently if something succeeds, unless there's a default property for SharePoint to display, it's just not going to display anything. And that can always be a little bit disconcerting. So right now I don't get anything. But if you want to see what's inside of a variable, the easiest thing to do is to simply type out the name of the variable. So in my case, $web. Hit enter, and you'll notice that once again I'm going to get that default property. Now if I want to get one of the non-default properties, maybe the title or description or anything like that, then what I can do is I could say $web, hit a dot, and then in my case I'm going to be looking for title. So what I could do is I could say capital T title, hit tab, and this will allow me to loop through all the different things that start with a T. So in this case I'm going to get theme, hit tab again, theme CSS, hit tab again, theme CSS, hit tab again, theme info, hit tab, and then there's my title. And now I can hit enter, and that will give me back the title, which again is central administration. Excellent. Now, I've done all of this from the management shell. But it is possible to connect to SharePoint just using normal PowerShell. Let me slide this up just a little bit, and I'm just going to launch the normal PowerShell window here. So let me just launch that, and I'm just going to resize this a little bit, and just like before, I'm going to change the font size, but I am going to leave the color scheme, partly just because I like the old Commodore 64 blue shaded glory there. It always reminds me of Commodore 64. But actually the bigger reason is so that way we can kind of see the difference between my PowerShell down below and the management shell that we used up above. And what I want you to notice here is that up top I've got my get spweb commandlet. So let's go ahead and try that down below. So let's just go ahead and say get spweb http :// SharePoint 2013 :4242. And when I hit enter here, you're going to notice that I'm going to get an error message. And my error message is going to tell me that it doesn't know what get spweb is. And the reason for that is because we have not loaded in the PowerShell commandlet. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say add dash ps snapin, and we'll just use tab to complete that out. And I'm going to say Microsoft .sharepoint.powershell and hit enter. And now you'll notice no reply. No reply means success. And I'm just going to hit the up arrow twice here to get back to my get spweb, hit enter, and now you'll notice that that succeeds. Now, the big reason that I always like to point this out is that one of the big things that you're going to be doing with PowerShell is you're going to be creating scripts. See, one of the great advantages to using PowerShell is partly A, so that way if I have to do something multiple times, it's much easier for me to do with PowerShell, but also B, if there's something that involves multiple steps, a lot of times just creating that script right up front and calling it multiple times is going to make your life a lot easier. Creating a brand new web application in SharePoint comes to mind as a perfect example, because what I need to do when I set up a web application is I need to check to see whether or not there's an entry in DNS, which I can script out using PowerShell. I need to create the web application inside of central administration, which I can script out using PowerShell, and then I need to create the site collection. Now, none of those are overly difficult, but one of the things that you'll notice, especially about creating the web application and the site collection, is that those just take a few seconds. So you'll go and you'll create the web application, and you'll wait, and you'll wait, and you'll wait, and eventually it will come back and say, okay, cool, that's done. And then you'll go in to create the site collection, and then you'll wait, and you'll wait, and you'll wait, and then that'll be done. It's so much easier just to be able to fire up a script, pass in the couple of names and URLs that you need, hit enter, and then walk away. And that way I can go get a cup of coffee, I can come back, and a minute later, it's done all the work for me. And that really is where scripts shine. Now, the whole catch is I want to make sure that my scripts are always going to run, and so that's where adding that snap-in comes into play. So whenever you're creating scripts, one of the things that I recommend is that you always put in that add PS snap-in at the top of your script file, so that way, if somebody doesn't launch this from the management shell, or maybe it's being scheduled out, that we know that it's still going to work. Now that we've seen how we can use central administration and PowerShell, let's actually get in and see it in action, shall we? After deploying out SharePoint, one of the things that you're going to find that you're going to need to devote a fair amount of attention to is optimizing the performance of SharePoint. And one of the biggest ways that you're going to do that is by controlling what services are executing what services. And so having that flexibility to be able to go into each individual server and stop and start services, which in turn will control which servers are going to be doing search, which servers are going to be acting as web front-end servers, etc., is going to have a pretty big impact on how I'm going to load balance and how I'm going to scale out my SharePoint farm. Now, a couple of services that I want to call out here. First of all, is central administration. By starting the service, that server will then serve up central administration. By default, the only server in the farm that will be running SharePoint's central administration is just the first server. So if I want multiple servers to be running that, then what I'm going to need to do is start that service on another server. The next one that I want to highlight is the SharePoint Foundation Web Application Service. Starting that service will make this a WFE or a web front-end server. And then finally, we've got our sandbox code solution. And the sandbox code solution is what's going to allow this server to run sandbox solutions. Sandbox solutions are ones that are going to have limited access to both resources as well as the API, but could be deployed by a site owner. They don't need to be deployed out by a farm administrator. Now, there's two different ways that we can manage our services. One way is by going into central administration, and all you have to do is go to System Settings, Services on Server, make sure that you choose the right server up top, and then go to Stop or Start to stop or start the appropriate service. Or, if I want to do this in PowerShell, then what I'm going to do is use Stop and Start SP Service Instance to stop and start it respectively. Now, two little catches there. Number one is if I want to run that on a different system, I'm going to use Invoke Command. Number two is this requires the GUID. So I will need to go retrieve the GUID. To do that, we're going to use Get SP Service Instance. What I want to do here is I want to take a look at how we're going to do this inside of central administration. And then I'm going to double back and take a look at how we're going to do this inside of PowerShell. Let's start off by going back to central administration. And what you'll notice is that right from here, I've got Manage Services on Server. Now, I can click on that link there, or I could go to System Settings and then click on it from there. Let me just click on it, and you'll notice, sure enough, there are all my services. If I want to change the server that I'm connected to, I just simply hit the little drop down, and I go to Change Server, and then choose the server that I'm wanting to configure. And then, of course, to stop or start a service, it's just as easy as finding the one that I want and hitting Stop or hitting Start. And that really is all there is to it. Now, let's see how we could do this in PowerShell. CLS clears the screen. And let's start off by saying Get SP Service Instance. And tab, by the way, will do an autocomplete, which definitely makes typing a whole lot easier. And I'm going to hit Enter. And this will now list off every single service that I have. Not really the most helpful formatting here, but if we take a look at the properties, what you're going to notice is that we've got a type name property and an ID property. So what I could do, and let's just use up arrow again, is I could send that into a select statement. And I could say select type name and the ID. And now if I hit enter, what you're going to notice is there on the left is all the type names, and there on the right is the GUID. And then I could go ahead and find the one that I want. But I could also use a where statement for this as well. So what I could do is just hit up arrow again, and let's just kind of move back, put in another pipe, and let's say where, and then in parentheses, $_ for the current object, dot type name, tick like, and then let's go with asterisk sandbox asterisk. And then I'm going to hit enter, and sure enough, that will give me the ID. And then what I could do, and I could do a couple of different things. I could keep using piping and so forth. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab the GUID here. So we'll just right-click, mark, highlight it, and then hit enter to copy it. And then I'm going to say stop SP service instance. And then I'm going to paste in my GUID. Hit enter. It'll ask me, am I sure I want to do that? I'm going to hit yes. And then if we just give it a moment here, count to 3 amongst yourselves, and I come back over here to Central Administration, and I hit refresh, what you're going to notice is that sure enough, it's now stopped. Cool. Another big thing that you're going to have to configure after deploying SharePoint is outgoing email. Outgoing email is going to be required for alerts, for when I add a new user to a group, when I give somebody permissions, etc. SharePoint needs to send email. Now, email is going to be sent through SMTP, and the big thing about the SMTP server is that it needs to support anonymous connections or relaying in order to work. SharePoint is not going to authenticate against the SMTP server. Now, if I want to configure this in PowerShell, then I can do that by actually connecting to the web application, calling the appropriate functions, which in this case is going to be update mail settings, or in Central Administration, I could just navigate to System Settings and then configure outgoing email. Let's do this. Let's go into PowerShell first, do our configuration, and then let's go into Central Administration and see the fact that it's saved there. So let's go back to PowerShell here, and let's just get ourselves a little bit more space, just CLS to clear the screen. And what I need to do is I need to connect to Central Administration. So I'm going to do that by declaring a variable. We'll just call it web app. And I'm going to set that equal to get SP web application. Now the thing about my web application, my get SP web application, is it automatically does not include or filters out Central Administration, since chances are that's probably not a web application you're looking to play with. So I need to tell it to include Central Administration, and then I'm going to specify the ID by just providing the URL, which is going to be http:// SharePoint 2013:4242. And I'm going to hit enter. Now, one of the disconcerting things sometimes about SharePoint, or I should say about PowerShell, is that when something works, all that happens is it just simply goes to the next line. So if I actually want to see this, then what I need to do is say $web app, hit enter, and you'll notice that I was able to successfully connect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say $webapp.update mail settings, and it wants to know my server, which is going to be mail.geektrainer.com. It wants to know my from, and let's just say PowerShell at geektrainer.com. And then the reply to, which is going to be PowerShell at geektrainer.com. And then finally, last but not least, is the encoding, and 65001 is going to be UTF-8. Hit enter. And then the other real quick thing that I always like to do is I always like to call update. And the reason for that is because a lot of the different properties and methods that you call on an object are done disconnected. So it's not actually going to save anything until you call update. So I always like to call update just to make sure. So now if we go back to central administration, I'm going to click on my system settings over here on the left, and let's configure our outgoing email settings. And you're going to notice, sure enough, it's got my PowerShell and my PowerShell. And of course, if I wanted to update this, it's just as simple as making the changes, hitting OK, and away we go. The one little catch that I want to point out about the from or the reply to address is users are going to get emails from this address, and there's a very good chance that your users may try to reply to the address. So I always recommend putting on an autoresponder, letting them know, psst, hey, this is an unmonitored address. Beyond just simply outgoing email is incoming email. Now, what incoming email will allow somebody to do is, through email, create list items. And this can be very helpful for situations where maybe I'm trying to create a help desk environment. And maybe we've been doing our help desk via email for years. Now, one of the things about most users is that they don't necessarily adapt to change really quickly. And so I may have a lot of users that just don't want to go to the Sharepoint list and create their trouble ticket there. They're just bound and determined. They've been sending email for all these years, and they're going to keep doing it. Gosh darn it. Okay, fine. What I could do is I could just simply set up my list, configure my list to accept email, and then just update the alias to point to that brand new email address. And now whenever a user sends an email, what are they doing behind the scenes? They're creating a Sharepoint list item. This can also be very helpful for vendors. That a vendor may do some work for me. They may want to send me an invoice. What I could do is I could just simply set up an email address where when they send me the invoice, we get it into our network, it's forwarded on to SharePoint, and automatically creates a list item. And then I can go ahead and kick off a workflow and take advantage of all the different SharePoint love that's now going to become available to me. Now, in order for this to work, I am going to need SMTP installed on a server on the farm. On top of that, if you're going to create your email addresses for SharePoint inside of Active Directory, then the farm account, that database access account, needs to have create permissions in the OU that's going to store those addresses. Now, as far as configuration goes, you're pretty much going to be stuck doing this inside of central administration. There is no good way to do this in PowerShell. Now, I suppose the nice part is that at least, you're only going to typically do this once, but unfortunately, yeah, there's no real good PowerShell way to do this. So let's go back to central administration and take a look at how we're going to do this inside of here. And it's just simply system settings, and then configure incoming email settings. And I'm going to get a little error message telling me I haven't installed SMTP, and I'm okay with that. I'm just going to hit OK. I really just want to show off the screen. And then you'll notice that all I have to do is just simply put a little dot next to yes, and then I'm going to go in and configure the rest of my settings here. I want to highlight the document management service. So if I want this to automatically create everything, I need to put the dot next to yes, and then specify the OU and the SMTP server. And if I scroll on down, you'll also notice the display address that we're going to use. So for example, I could say mylist at, and maybe sharepoint.geektrainer.com. Last but not least, at least for this lesson, is SharePoint Designer. SharePoint Designer is a wonderful tool because SharePoint Designer will allow power users to manipulate and massage and do all sorts of wonderful things to the look and feel and structure of your SharePoint sites and pages. SharePoint Designer is also a potentially terrible tool because it will allow people to do all sorts of mean, nasty, rotten things to your SharePoint sites. And so as a result, you may decide that you want to limit the access that people have to SharePoint Designer. Now this is done on a web application by web application basis. So I can determine that certain web applications I'm going to maintain a little bit more control over, while other web applications I'm going to give you maybe a little bit more free reign over. Now where this is hiding is inside of General Application Settings and then SharePoint Designer Settings for central administration. For PowerShell, unfortunately there is no native commandlet, but we do have different properties that we can specify to configure the SharePoint Designer access. So if we take a look back at Central Administration, and let me just scroll on up here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my General Application Settings, and you'll notice that I've got my Configure SharePoint Designer settings. And then I'm going to choose a web application. We'll hit the little drop down, change web application, and let's just choose our central administration site. It's the only one that we've got at the moment. And you'll notice that by default, SharePoint is enabled. Now if I want to go in and turn any of this on or off, then all I have to do is just simply take the checkboxes away and hit OK. Now if I go back to here, you're going to notice the basic settings. First of all, whether or not I want to allow for SharePoint Designer in the first place. The second one is whether or not I want to allow you to customize a page. And that's what the detach pages from site template means, is that I'm able to customize the page through SharePoint Designer. The master page, disconnecting master page, allows you to then disconnect a master page from the template. And then finally, to be able to manage the site structure through SharePoint Designer, that's the last option of allow site collection administrators to see the URL structure of the website. Now if we want to do this through PowerShell, then what we're going to do is actually basically the same thing that we did before. That I'm going to once again go grab the web app, get our web application, include central administration, identity, and then http://SharePoint 2013 4242. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say $webapp dot, and let's just go with our show URL structure, and I'm going to set that to $true. Now, before I actually execute that, let me come back over here. Let me just hit refresh, and I'm just going to show that that's currently disabled, so false. The check mark is gone. And if I come back over here and I hit enter, and I come back over here to the management shell and I hit refresh, you'll notice it's still cleared. The reason for that is because whenever you're configuring properties through PowerShell, this is offline. So you always need to call update. So $webapp.update and hit a carriage return. And now, when I come back over here and I hit refresh, now you'll notice that the checkbox is there. And that's why I like to just keep myself in the habit of always calling update on any of the SharePoint objects. So that way, once I'm done, I'm ready to go, always call update in PowerShell. Now that's just a few of the different things that we can do with both central administration and PowerShell, and a few of the little options that are available to us. Needless to say, there's a lot more, but that's okay, because we've got a lot more lessons to go through to get deeper into SharePoint and all the different things that we can do.